Hi, and welcome to Santa Barbara Newsmakers. I'm your host, Jerry Roberts. Today's program is part of our special series of interviews with the candidates to be Santa Barbara's next mayor. Our guest today is Councilmember Bendy White. A third-generation Santa Barbaran, he has served on key local boards and commissions for more than 30 years. A co-founder of the Environmental Defense Center, he was elected to council in 2009, re-elected in 2013, and has a well-earned reputation at City Hall as the compromise-minded man in the middle. Say that 3 times fast. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jerry.
The biggest question on everybody's mind about your campaign, and I think there's no doubt about that, where does the name Bendy come from?
That's one I can answer. Well, I was born on Benjamin Franklin's birthday.
Really?
And and my family gives each person a nickname of some kind. So out of Benjamin came Bendy. Others were Storky and Wiggy and Todney. But they had the brains to offload those names in their adolescence, whereas I seemed to stick it out.
You kept using your given name as Harwood, which was your dad's name.
That's exactly right.
And a very prominent family in Santa Barbara. We were talking about it a little bit. Your dad was a writer, among other things, and co-wrote a book with Stuart E. White, the famed novelist of the West and psychic, and it was called Across the Unknown, about communing with the dead, essentially. Do you have recollections of that? Was that discussed around the dinner table?
Well, my father died when I was very young, so and my mother was a reluctant participant in all of the psychic spiritualist activities. What I witnessed as a youngster, and really throughout the rest of her life, was a real skepticism and even a little bit of resentment about it. She just thought that maybe there was quite a bit of hogwash involved in this, and
too much attention was being paid to it.
Well, again, that was just her view. She was very much a on the ground kind of a gal, and
but one of many fascinating characters in your family. And you talked about maybe doing a book sometime about Stuart White. Tell us a little bit about him.
Well, he was. First of all, he started writing at a crazy young age. I mean, his first published pieces are when he's something like 14 years old, when he was publishing ornithological work. He was a bird watcher, and he learned that he could get stuff out there that he had written. But then from there, he idolized his father, and his early work is frames.
This is your grandpa?
Yes, grandpa, who was a timberman in Michigan, and also an avid hunter. And so those were 2 themes that Stuart picked up on early, wrote both children's books and then books for adults, of course, about the adventures of the North Woods. That was his first area of focus.
And he was a conservationist as well.
He was. He actually befriended Theodore Roosevelt, who was quite a chunk older than he, but Roosevelt recognized in him, and of course Stuart came from a prominent family, so they were able to communicate, and Stuart really was taught, got some good teachings out of our president.
Interesting. Let's talk about the mayor's race a little bit. It took you a while to decide to run. I think you got in on the very last day. And you said that you had plotted your cliche retirement, including the Winnebago. And I love this quote: "Is a marathon runner lazy because he's running slow?" You said of your entry. Why did you decide to run? Why did it take you so long to get in?
Well, why did it take me so long? I thought, in talking with my better half, we said, well, I've put in a lot of years in public service and 8 years on council, which is really all consuming. And so we could very well take this as a break and move on to something else. And then as I looked at the field, I felt like there wasn't a seasoned person of my stripe, centrist views, who was in the hunt. And I appreciate that I just saw Hal leave here, and Hal and I one of the amusing cross currents is that
Hal Conklin
is that in our early work was at the Ecology Center, the predecessor to the Community Environmental Council, and I wrote for that little magazine called Survival Times, and one of my pieces was on the Carpinteria Slough. My first piece, as a matter of fact, was on the real threat to the Carpinteria Slough. And Hal edited a couple of my pieces in that era. So, and Hal and I think we have a lot of commonality in our policy base. But why did I then get in? I had concerns that perhaps Hal's candidacy would not hold up. We'll see how that plays out. But that worried me. And so then you have basically candidates that I felt were not going to fulfill the policy goals that I believe we've laid out so far, having to do with infrastructure, the housing, AUD issues, I think, are ones that I've taken a strong hand in crafting and yet it needs a goodly amount of work now. And those are areas that I want to see if we can get right.
Well, you got Kathy Murillo on the right and Frank Hotchkiss Kathy on the left and Frank Hotchkiss on the right, and I think you're pretty squarely in the middle with Hal Conklin and Angel Martinez in there as well. The noted progressive Jim Hightower famously said that there's nothing in the middle of the road but yellow stripes and dead armadillos, and yet you actively embrace this centrist man in the middle role. Why?
Well, and I define it more as a razor blade. Instead of it being the yellow line, I see it as a razor blade. So it's about the equal comfort level. You land where you land. And I've been doing this work for a long time. I think that locally, the more local you get, perhaps the more centrist you get, that we have a place to take care of here. So we don't have unlimited budgets for this and that. There are strict limits to about everything that we do, from water supply to housing to jobs, etc. So we're taking care of a household, as it were, our village. That's how I see the work that council does. And that ends up being business-like decisions. It's not necessarily always the kindest decisions. It's trying to look long-term and say, how are we going to take care of this place and these people in the long term? And so I think that those are business-like decisions that get made, hopefully with compassion and with doing more than our fair share in the areas of social service.
So there's always this conflict between folks who want to preserve and protect, keep things the way that they have been in Santa Barbara, keep Santa Barbara's specialness, as it were, and others, people who want to, for the future, need to change things. And so you're trying to balance those two things, essentially. Are those the two pressures?
Those are two key pressures. We've inherited a place here that is unique in the world. Even coming in here, talking to some of your colleagues, go elsewhere. The greatest thing is to come home and you see how well taken care of and how beautiful the place is that we live. So we don't want to lose that, and we can. We've seen. I mean, you look to our south. Look to the Los Angeles basin. That had to have been Eden at one point. And a lot of heartless, short-sighted activities occurred there, which rendered it a lot less hospitable than what you see up here, where people from 120 years ago started saying, wow, this is special. I have the means to donate this park, this building, make this happen. So we're the beneficiaries a century later, and of not just those original givers, but then generation after generation of generosity producing this town. We don't want to mess that up while we still need to provide, to work toward, as I say, being compassionate, providing services, providing housing where we can.
Well, let's talk about some of the specific issues that arise from that essential conflict. Randy Alcorn, one of our great libertarian journalists, writes in Newshawk in an op-ed piece, he says, there is no housing crisis in Santa Barbara, and there is no shortage of affordable housing. What there is are too many people who want to live here for a price they can afford. And there are the forces of greed all too eager to profit by building a few affordable units, along with many more new market rate units. Do you think there's a housing crisis in Santa Barbara?
I do. And I agree with a lot of what Randy is writing there. Most of the housing built in Santa Barbara over the last 50, 60 years has been built as workforce housing. If you go back after World War II, subdivisions, I live in one of those subdivision houses built in '49. I would wager that it sold for 10 grand or some kind of number like that. The Mesa is those were subdivisions that I believe started at $5,000 after the Korean War. So they were built with that intent. You go to the west side, you see those little $800,000 houses or whatever. They were built to be workforce housing. So the intent was there to begin with. There just obviously were no price restrictions in place, which is the kind of social engineering which we start seeing come into the equation. What, in the 70s is when the affordable housing started to get mandated.
So in terms of social engineering, we have the average unit size density program with which you've been closely identified. It's producing rental housing, but it has not been affordable for
Exactly.
workforces. So given the rents, $3,000 a month and upward that we've seen coming out of that program so far, is it a failure? Is that program?
Well, it certainly is a surprise, and that lack of affordability is worrisome, and it warrants our attention. So what can we do about it? One good idea, I think, that's on our plates for the next increment, and this is the city's housing task force, which I chair, is to score projects, to say that a project proposes to provide a certain number of its units in one affordable range or another, and gets a score for that. So let's say a quarter of the units are at some price restricted level. They would get stronger preference than a completely free market
in going
project.
Through the process.
In going through the process. That sort of thing.
Yeah, and what would you ballpark that rental as? In other words, what is affordable? What would you consider that? What would you give a higher score to a developer for?
Well, there are I think 4 HUD or some such metrics for.
Do we still have HUD? Wait a minute.
Yeah, right, exactly. Whatever it's called. Metrics for affordability. There's very low, medium, and upper medium, in fact.
Right.
And any of those would be better than just the wide open market charging $2,800 for a 1-bedroom unit. We're looking for anything that gets into the range of workforce. Where can teachers live? Where can nurses live? Where can regular folks live? Not just poor folks, but regular folks.
You use the word surprise to reference what's happened with the AUD so far. What's been the surprise? The number of units that came out of it, the rents, the size?
The answer is yes. The AUD was put together as an experiment with 250 units. We're going to reassess this whole program after 250 units are built and up and running and occupied. okay, with the 250, we'll know whether the parking is out of whack. We'll know whether the rents are out of whack. We'll just know whether it's compatible with the neighborhood.
And the council's now taken steps to modify the original proposal, including putting a cap on and some changes in the parking.
Modifications, again, part of the whole plan of Plan Santa Barbara, the general plan, is to create an adaptive management component that says, we don't know what all the consequences of these proposed policies are going to be, so let's make sure we're staying flexible and nimble. Let's build into this plan the ability to change, to monitor, to test, and make sure that we're accomplishing what we intend to accomplish. So to be coming back to this program now and saying, whoa, this isn't working, we need to do something to make it better, is built in, it's baked into the general plan as, now it's not, it certainly isn't easy. And you were asking, well, what's the surprise? I believe we've had a total of something like 1,600 units applied for in the city. This is for our experiment of 250. So
there's interest in building
that's
rentals.
A capital E and capital I. And another piece is this was crafted, what was it, was it 2010, 11, 12, somewhere in there, when we're just coming out of the crash. And so the notion of people, and there were 0 building permits. So the fact that we'd look ahead and say, well, in 5 years, we're going to be having this boom, this unprecedented boom, or at least another boom, I think would have surprised us.
So we have to remember the AUD, but we also have to remember the ADU, the accessory dwelling unit program, where so-called granny units. The city has no choice but to do this. It's a state mandate. But what can the council do, and what would you as mayor propose to do to ensure that granny units don't overwhelm neighborhoods?
I would say, as mayor, I would do what the state will allow us to do. And we'll know more about that. The city is behind the curve on this one, and definitely we did not have an ordinance prepared when this became law in January. That's in the works now, and there are moderate limits on what we can do to restrict these things. That's what the state was doing. This is a top-down, shove it down your throat kind of a law. And I would restrict it where I could, and obviously where a council of 7 is willing to go. In fact, it's going to take 5 votes, I believe, to get an ordinance passed. So it's going to be a discussion amongst a very different council. This is going to be a council of districts. There's going to be some new faces there. How is that all going to play out? Obviously the ADU has been a hot topic for the last quarter century. The city of Santa Barbara has rejected it fundamentally.
Well, I would think that with a district council, there's going to be a lot of pushback.
I would too.
On the side of doing less rather than doing more. Just quickly on vacation rentals, I'm troubled by this philosophically. The notion that government would say that property owners cannot decide, what term of rental to use for a bedroom or for another property on their unit. How do you defend that? How do you defend a crackdown on vacation rental?
Well, the city lost. First of all, it is against the law. Has been against the law. This is nothing new.
Well, except people have been doing it and they've been paying. The city's been getting revenue, bed tax for it. There have been companies that have been active, managing it for property owners for some time.
Yeah, and of course you go back again longer than 10 years ago, and the sharing economy didn't exist.
Right.
So if Joe Smith wanted to rent his house out for a week and found somebody somewhere to do that, it sort of happened and no big deal. Even though, if you look at the zoning ordinances at the time, they said, thou shalt rent for 30 days or longer, is on all the books, both in the city and county. Has been and is today. no change. But the sharing economy obviously changed that. It's the
professionalized it.
Professionalized it, and anyway, certainly created the wave. The city lost 1,000 units roughly to short-term rentals in a very short period of time in this housing shortage. So it's a real number that had...
1,000 is a real number?
Yes.
How was that data again? I didn't...
There were 1,000 units in the city that were in the
converted?
short-term rental world.
Were these new units that were built for that purpose?
Of course not.
No, they were converted for...
Correct.
Okay.
And squeezed yet. I mean, we've had sort of one pressure upon the other building in housing, the short-term being one, the student rental housing being another. It's a force that's gathering momentum and is squeezing out mostly workforce.
All right. Let's talk about State Street. How would you describe the current economic and physical conditions of downtown State Street?
State Street is a beautiful legacy community space which is caught in the Amazon.com revolution right now.
Decline of
sticks
retail.
and bricks retail just going through a real trauma now. And the good news there is that we have this need for housing. We have these spaces opening up on State Street. There has been this protection of retail on State that's gone on for decades, where it says, we can't get too much competition for the retail because the retail is our golden goose. Well, the goose is no longer golden, so we need to find another tool. I believe it's a residential mixed-use alternative there.
So Macy's should be rental housing?
I'm not going to be as prescriptive as that. I'm going to say more, take this corridor, the Chapala-Anacapa corridor, and open it up to housing, encouraging housing. Parking is another issue there where we have major resources in the way of parking. Is there not a way that we can marry up some housing to our parking structures, for example, to provide parking? Residential parking is mostly at night. Those structures are empty at night. Might there be opportunities for that parking to get used for residential purposes?
Isn't the biggest problem on State Street aggressive panhandling and vagrancy?
I think that it's the death of retail is stronger than that.
Okay.
It's a problem.
Would you change the city's approach to panhandling and vagrancy?
I would keep on doing the things that we're doing now. One area where I am concerned and have been for years is Santa Barbara does more than its fair share. We have 40% of the South Coast population, and I believe we still have somewhere near 100% of its homeless beds. We have in the areas of halfway houses and New House, for example, and those sorts of facilities for substance abuse and such. Santa Barbara City does more than its fair share. We need our sister communities to step up and help.
A more regional
exactly
approach. All right, we got about 3 minutes. I want to be sure we cover these things. You're very supportive of the 1 cent sales tax.
I am.
Increase. How do you ensure that it's going to go for infrastructure and public works and what it's supposed to be? There's a lot of concern about that, the accountability.
And I share that concern. I propose that the City of Santa Barbara council resolve to every election cycle have a review of the sales tax and its success or failure. How have the last 2 years done in terms of meeting the mission of that sales tax? And should we sunset it? Should we put a sunset on it? And that should be looked at every 2 years as part of the analysis and take on.
There's no sunset on this.
There is no sunset.
Yeah.
And there's a good reason for there not to be a sunset for now, which is we may, in 5 years, we may want to do a 30-year bond for let's say we get the street repair bill all put into a package. We want to get $20 million to do a major paving rehab in Santa Barbara. We want to bond for that for 30 years, get the best rates. We want to do that, and then afterwards we may choose to go into a sunset proposal. That's what it was 2 years ago, Jerry, and I supported that too. And there were 3 people on council that did not, and I'm very disappointed that we didn't do that.
We have a $250 million unfunded liability for pensions. Are you satisfied council and the city have done enough to address that problem? Or
I am terribly disturbed with that number. It's and understand that is a state-driven number. We don't have control
we're on the
over
hook
that.
for it.
We're on the hook, but we don't have participation in creating those laws, and that's wrong. And I believe that where any kind of solution is going to come out of that's any improvement, is going to come probably out of a statewide initiative.
real quickly, do you support the so-called state sanctuary bill on immigration, Senate Bill 54? As you know, Sheriff Brown is vehemently against that, and all the sheriffs are.
I would need to look at it more closely. I don't have a position on that yet.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for being with us today, Bendy White,
my
and
pleasure.
we hope you'll come back during the campaign to talk about some of the issues as we go along.
I'd be
that's
delighted
a
to.
confirmation. Okay. All right.
I'll do it.
And thanks to all our loyal viewers for checking in online or on TVSB's Channel 17. You can check out our complete set of interviews with the mayoral candidates on YouTube. Find us on newsmakerswithjerryroberts.com, and look for the return of our Newsmakers panel of journalists starting September 7th. Thanks today to our director, Oscar Gutierrez, to our crew, Mark, Anthony, Kendrick, and Ken, our marketing director, Maggie Mabuchi, our legal advisors, Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, and as always, our senior high-ranking, all-powerful chief executive producer, Hap Freund. Thanks for watching Newsmakers. We'll see you next time.